Hello, dear friends. Today we will continue our journey through Otto Carius's memoirs. Don't forget to leave your opinion about this material and support this video with a like. Well, let's begin. Mutiny in the bunker. At the rear base on the Baltic coast, we finally had the opportunity to spend a few days repairing equipment and resting our personnel. The crews of our 3 tanks were in dire need of rest. During several previous operations, they had not had a moment's respite, day or night. Despite all their fortitude and desire to go into battle, human capabilities have their limits, so we needed to relax. And we succeeded. I particularly enjoyed being able to listen to good music on the radio again. We sometimes argued with the commander about this. I liked more serious music, while he preferred modern light music. In our recreation area, I became attached to a 4-legged friend, a German shepherd named Hasso. Von Schiller traded him to the military police for a bottle of schnapps. The dog became useless to the police after he broke his teeth on a brick. Hasso, who was exceptionally well trained, brought me great joy. He climbed stairs with ease, jumped remarkably high, and even retrieved objects from the water despite the strong currents in the Baltic Sea. He guarded a small forest area until he was given the order to be released from service. Hasso was a one-of-a-kind dog. For example, he could drop a piece of meat on command, even if he was already holding it in his mouth. He followed me everywhere and laid his head on my feet when I slept on the sofa at night. If he needed to relieve himself in the morning, he would lick my hand until I woke up and took him outside. Although he was a companion dog and had already had many owners, he became particularly attached to me, although he never forgot what he had already been taught. So, during my entire vacation, I had all kinds of entertainment. But my joy was not unclouded. The commander was somewhat jealous of me because I got along well with everyone. But he was not jealous of me to the same extent in all the hardships that accompanied my successes. He marveled at our hunting luck, while he still hadn't been able to knock out a single tank. The fact that, unlike him, we were constantly at work must have escaped his attention. If the 2 tigers in our company were combat ready, I was always in one of them. After all, how long were we forced to stay in Limbitu without performing any tasks until we finally earned our bread and butter? Von Schiller reminded me of a lucky hunter who believed that one could simply go into the forest and shoot a deer waiting there. I got along with him when we were alone because I was aware of his shortcomings. Everything was fine when I was on a mission and he was with his company at the rear base. However, there was often some tension in Silame. I got into the habit of communicating frequently with my subordinates. The commander didn't like that. He believed that distance should be maintained. Thank God I didn't think that was necessary. I never knew of a case where someone treated me inappropriately, so I was always a kind of buffer between the axe and the stone. I had to calm down the sergeants when they complained about their commanders, and I also had to constantly convince the commanders that our personnel were great guys who could be relied upon. Probably because of the fierce fighting, my subordinates were on edge, and one day the bomb exploded, with consequences far more serious than I had expected. What's more, it was the Russians who triggered what happened. They didn't allow us to enjoy our well-deserved rest, even in our reserve positions. They were constantly firing, and their long-range artillery, located south of Narva, was firing shells over our heads at sea. In fact, they wanted to hit the highway, but the shells fell too far. When they flew over our heads, we had the feeling that they were carrying the roof with them. This kind of unpleasant barrage occurred above us about once every 2 hours. We heard a muffled sound from afar and could calculate to the second when they would fly over us and where. The sentry had to immediately report the start of heavy artillery fire. There was an order that everyone should run to the basement of the house during shelling. This order was entirely justified, as confirmed by an incident when a Russian shell fell short. A non-commissioned officer from the repair platoon and the company clerk were killed by shrapnel as they made their way to the shelter, but did not make it in time. Therefore, caution was absolutely necessary. However, the sergeants who slept in another room next to ours were annoyed that the commander was always the first to jump into the basement through a hole in the floor, even though there was no need to rush. Moreover, according to military tradition, the commander should think about his personal safety last. The company signalman, Sergeant Shotrov, who was otherwise a calm, reliable man and an exemplary soldier, lost his temper and insulted von Schiller. It almost came to blows. The sergeant was taken into custody as a mutineer. Von Schiller insisted that I accompany him immediately to the military tribunal. In any case, we had to go to a meeting with the commander of the tank regiment of the Great Germany Division, Colonel Count Strachwitz. On the way, I urged von Schiller not to ruin the life of such a reliable soldier as Shotrov. In the end, I managed to make him hesitate. He probably realized that at the tribunal he would have to say things that would be unpleasant for him. Be that as it may, to my great relief, he turned to me and said, "All right, Otto, I've thought it over. For your sake, I will punish Shotrov for his disgraceful behavior. I will put him under arrest and then take him with me into combat." I remained silent. A huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Sergeant Shotrov was given the most severe punishment that the company commander could impose. He was forbidden to leave the company's location. He then had to perform the duties of a radio operator in the commander's tank during the next few battles. The latter punishment was doubly false psychologically. Assignment to frontline units could not be a punishment, but only a duty for each of us. It was required of all of us as a matter of course. It should be noted that Shotrov often asked to be allowed to participate in at least a few attacks. However, he was always refused because it was difficult to find a replacement for him. Finally, von Schiller would never have been allowed to take him into his tank, which was soon confirmed. Operation Strachwica. Reserve Colonel Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz was the kind of person you would never forget once you met him. An excellent organizer, he gave his subordinates the opportunity to show their ingenuity and considered this a matter of course. We were very fortunate to have participated in several operations under his command. They were excellent examples of successful operations. Count Strachwitz received the Knight's Cross on August 25, 1941, while still a reserve major and commander of the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Tank Regiment. On November 17, 1942, he was awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. As a colonel and commander of the Tank Regiment of the Great Germany Division, he received swords to the Knight's Cross on March 28, 1943. We contributed to the operation in question. For its successful completion, he was awarded diamonds to the Knight's Cross on March 15, 1944. Rumors claimed that Strachwitz was removed from command of the tank regiment of the Great Germany Division due to excessive losses. I have legitimate doubts about these claims. Count Strachwitz and his personnel were always deployed in hotspots on the front line, where they had to carry out extremely difficult operations. Heavy losses could not always be avoided in this kind of combat, but it was precisely these operations that saved the lives of many soldiers from other units. Count Strachwitz brought personnel with him from Greater Germany, as well as several tanks and armored personnel carriers. Our company played only a minor role in the first operation, which was designed to cut off the eastern pocket and destroy it. The attack was carried out from west to east near the heel of the boot. An offensive front was formed, and the pocket was finally eliminated. The road that had to be used for this was not wide or solid enough for our Tigers, so they had to make do with T4 tanks, which were 30 tons lighter. Their count took them with him. He rode in the lead tank and thus won our trust from the very beginning. In this operation, we were only responsible for holding back the onslaught that other areas of the western pocket were naturally subjected to as a result of the attack. The entire operation was supported by Stuka dive bombers, or rather, it was supposed to be supported by dive bombers. However, they proved ineffective in the densely forested area and even posed a danger to our troops. The pilots were unable to identify their targets. The Junkers 87s arrived on time and bravely dove on their designated targets. One of their bombs fell on the only road that the attacking tanks could use. Had it fallen a minute later, Count Strachwitz himself would have been a victim of this bomb. He burst out with curses, and the infantry had to carry out the attack without the support of armored vehicles. It should be noted that the planned objectives had to be achieved at any cost before nightfall. Otherwise, there was a danger that the Russians would break out of the pocket to the south or move on our own positions, which were hanging by a thread. In fact, Strachwitz achieved his goal without tanks or dive bombers. The next day, the pocket was eliminated. Most of the Russians were taken prisoner along with their military equipment. Only a few of them managed to escape south at night, where the Russians were preparing a counteroffensive. This powerful setback led the enemy to concentrate even more soldiers and military equipment in the eastern pocket than before. He did not expect that we would reach him in a completely different way. The Count had his quirks, but no one treated him worse because of that, because he had already won our respect and recognition. For example, he did not allow anyone to address him as Colonel. People who knew him when he was still a major said that he was also not shy about letting his superiors know that he was a Count. He said that the title of Count meant more than a military rank. At the first briefing, he left no doubt as to how he envisioned the operation. His bold plans surprised us, but soon we realized that they made a lot of sense. "Well, gentlemen, this is how I see it," he said somewhat haughtily. "Our combat group will launch a frontal attack on the so-called Eastern Pocket. From the children's home, we will move across the plain to the railroad crossing. 4 Tigers will follow in the vanguard. After crossing the railroad embankment, they will turn right and strike the flank. The next 4 Tigers, each carrying infantry, will rush like devils to the fork in the road, which is 100 meters southeast of the railroad crossing. This fork must be reached as quickly as possible and guarded to ensure passage through it. In this way, 4 T4 tanks and armored personnel carriers will be able to move forward and occupy the plain that descends to the base of the pocket." He pointed to the map. "This is how it can be done. At night, a ring of encirclement will be established and held until another infantry regiment forms a front line. Then contact will be established to the west and east. The main thing I want to draw your attention to is that the entire operation must proceed exactly according to plan. This means that no tank should remain on the road and interfere with me. Delays could jeopardize the success of the entire operation, and I will not allow such delays to occur. So I categorically demand that every immobilized tank be towed into the swamp by any means possible and not delay other vehicles. The responsibility for the success of the operation rests directly with the tank commander, regardless of his rank. Is that clear to everyone? Yes, sir, Count. The colonel twisted his lips into a sarcastic smile. He knew that we had made some comments about the treatment he demanded. None of them would be found in a textbook on good manners. Very well. So far, everything had been quite simple. But now there was a question for the Tiger crews. Which battalion would you like to fight with? We looked at each other, amazed at the generosity of such an offer, and immediately chose the infantry battalion with which we had already been operating. Very well, you shall have it. The colonel turned to his aide. Make sure these infantrymen are taken from the front in Narva, where they are now, and transferred here. We'll talk later about the use of flamethrowers, engineering units, artillery observers, and everything else. Fire superiority in this area will be provided by attack aircraft. An agreement has already been reached with the air group. You will have the necessary radio communication with the dive bombers via the armored personnel carrier provided to you. Anything else? Oh yes, of course. You will receive maps and aerial photographs. They were made specifically for this operation. All areas important to you are marked with numbers. This will prevent misunderstandings and unnecessary questions. Moreover, you will be able to quickly and accurately report your location. That's all for today. Any questions? No? Good. Thank you, gentlemen. A few days ago, a new type of mine-clearing device for tanks was ordered for delivery by air. This was done just before the start of the operation, which was scheduled for April 6th. The device was a heavy roller that moved in front of the tank. It caused mines to explode before the tank ran over them. However, the new device did not catch on because it significantly slowed down the movement of the tanks. We refused to use it, despite the danger of mines. Operation Straczwica was then rehearsed twice far behind the front line, in an area resembling an eastern pocket. This was done without the Luftwaffe and artillery, of course, but with live ammunition. The commander of Army Group North was personally present and had a brief conversation with us after the training. He pointed out the importance of this operation. The bridgehead at Narva had to be held at all costs because of the oil shale deposits in Estonia. Oil was extremely necessary to ensure the operation of our submarines. Again, we did not think about why Estonian oil was so important for Germany's war effort. We were completely absorbed in the mission ahead of us. Shortly before the attack began, we moved to our assembly areas behind the children's home hill. We had to be extremely careful, avoiding any noise so as not to attract the attention of the Russians. As usual, the artillery opened diversionary fire to provide background noise. The Count had thought of everything. The infantry was already in place, and each squad quickly found its tank, as we knew each other well from training. Everything worked like clockwork. Our 4 Tigers moved in the following order: Kircher, me, Zavetti, and Gruber. Count Strachwitz strictly forbade the unit commander from leading the column. This way, the attack would not be delayed if the first tank hit a mine. Therefore, contrary to custom, I had to drive second this time, even though in wooded terrain, the situation can only be properly assessed from the lead vehicle. It was only natural that the Tigers were in front. Thanks to the fact that we had been operating there for several weeks, we knew the Lembitu area like the back of our hands. We were familiar with every crater, and we even briefly surveyed the area behind the railway embankment. The 3 commanders I had gathered around me were the ideal type of tank commander. Such perfection is rarely found. During the previous difficult months, I had worked side by side with each of these comrades in all operations. Therefore, I hope I will be allowed to single them out without trying to diminish the importance of the other commanders: Linka, Vizeli, Carpenetto, Gering, Riel, Meyer, and Hermann. They were simply less fortunate with their tanks. They sometimes had to borrow another vehicle, so they did not stand out, even though they were highly skilled. Our advance group did not have any motorized infantry. Gruber and Zeti took 3 sappers each as guests on their tanks. They were supposed to help us if we encountered mines along the way. It should be noted that nothing happened to these sappers during the operation. As soon as we stopped, they immediately disappeared from view, so they were better off than us in the tanks. Count Strachwitz built 2 shelters in the children's home, one for himself and the other for his adjutant. This amazing count really thought of everything. Attacking infantrymen are better off moving without winter clothing. For this reason, the clothing was collected and tied up by a special team. Each bundle was marked, and the clothing was to be delivered by armored personnel carrier immediately after the operation was completed, so that the soldiers would not have to freeze after the attack. In the days leading up to the attack, the deputy commander had to determine at what time in the morning it would be light enough for good visibility and accurate shooting. The time of the attack was set based on these calculations. Artillery preparation was to begin 5 minutes before the attack, and fire was to be transferred after another 5 minutes. By the end of the first 5 minutes, we were to have already crossed the railway embankment. Shortly before the attack began, the Count approached us with his usual cane to observe the breakthrough from our position. Then we witnessed a barrage of fire that we never saw again until the end of the war. 37mm rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns, 20mm quadruple anti-aircraft machine guns, and 88mm anti-aircraft guns were arranged in a semicircle around the eastern pocket. They fired tracer shells, which created a veritable dome of fire under which we could move to its southern edge. A regiment of rocket mortars fired on the areas, first with incendiary rockets, and then with high explosive shells. The effect was devastating, as we later saw for ourselves. It should be noted that the low-growing forest among the swamps prevented the pressure of the blast wave from rising, so the fire burned the trees and the flames rose several meters high. All Russians who did not take shelter were fatally wounded on the spot. At the same time, artillery units with 280mm howitzers fired for total destruction. Under cover of a curtain of fire, we moved at high speed toward the railroad crossing. We saw Russians running from a series of destroyed fortifications they had occupied to the trenches of the railroad crossing. Our machine gun fire was completely ineffective while moving at speed. In the blink of an eye, we crossed the crossing. Contrary to expectations, it was not mined, as the Russians needed the road to the south to transport their own supplies. Our attack must have come as a complete surprise to the Russians. After our tanks had passed the railroad crossing and turned right, we saw a Russian standing rooted to the spot in a gymnasterka in Galife right in front of us. He couldn't believe his eyes that we were already there. Kircher dealt with the anti-tank gun, which was apparently supposed to cover the road. Its barrel was still covered, and the crew was not there. Then we drove along the embankment, heading west. The plain between the railroad and the forest line was mined, so we drove in single file, keeping an eye on each other. Fortunately, the mines were exposed. The Russians had not had time to cover them with earth because of the frost. In addition, the box mines that had been dug in were damp in this marshy area. So we reached our intermediate goal without any losses. Then we turned right and saw what the Russian positions looked like from the rear. The enemy had built bunkers in the railway embankment every 2 meters. Of course, they no longer provided them with any protection. 7 anti-tank guns, which the unsuspecting enemy had not had time to deploy, were immediately neutralized. We were in high spirits because our breakthrough, on which everything depended at that moment, had succeeded, contrary to expectations. The brilliantly planned operation had borne fruit. However, our good mood was suddenly spoiled by an unpleasant surprise. Right there, our own battery of 150mm infantry howitzers suddenly started firing heavily at us from the direction of the children's home. The observer mistook our tanks for enemy tanks. The silhouettes of our vehicles had barely appeared from behind the railway embankment when we started firing in the direction of our own positions. We were clearly shown how unpleasant the fire from these guns was. We could clearly hear every command and see the large caliber shells flying in a gentle trajectory straight in our direction. It was not a feeling for the faint of heart. We were forced to drive back and forth across mine-infested terrain to avoid the dangerous parcels. These movements could be called continuous position changes, but who would want a 150mm shell to hit them in the head? On top of everything else, our guys were shooting very well. Of course, I immediately radioed the observer in the children's home to report the mistake. It was becoming more and more uncomfortable because our guys didn't stop firing all 4 guns. I had no choice but to fire a few shots in the direction of the observer. This forced him to change position, and we retreated without waiting for him to start causing us trouble again. Later, I gave the guy a dressing down. He really didn't recognize us, refusing to believe that we were moving so fast behind the railroad embankment. The friendly fire had other unpleasant consequences. We did come out of it unscathed, but the tension and constant maneuvering back and forth distracted our attention, and we didn't notice the anti-tank gun that had taken up position in the forest behind us. That's when we got scared, caught off guard. I was hit in the stern. Pz.VI got the guy and covered us to avoid any more surprises. Almost at the same time, they hit Gruber on the right. The Russians quickly managed to turn the anti-tank gun, which was in a small grove near the railroad crossing. We didn't spot it, and it hit Gruber. The first shot severely damaged the running gear, and the second shot pierced the tank. Gruber and the loader were wounded. First of all, we silenced the anti-tank gun. Then Pz.VI drove the tank out of the minefield towards the railroad crossing. My tank could barely move under its own power. Pz.VI covered it and took it back to the children's home. Every cloud has a silver lining. We didn't have to tow Gruber's tank because all hell had broken loose in our area. Even the Russian heavy artillery south of Narva had entered the fray. The Russians wanted to turn the tide at any cost. We had no time for the remaining Russian infantry because we had to follow the advance guard, which had long since passed the fork in the road at the railroad crossing. Von Schiller, with his 4 vehicles and the support of the infantry, ensured free passage to the swampy forest. Unfortunately, the infantry battalion suffered heavy losses from Russian artillery. Reaching the fork in the road, the infantrymen jumped into a trench in search of cover. The Russians, realizing that we had broken through to the south, fired artillery and mortars precisely at this spot. One shell hit right in the thick of our infantrymen. Since they were lying quite close to each other, the losses were very heavy. As we drove south through the forest, the Russians were waiting for us everywhere. We had to be extremely careful to avoid new, unpleasant surprises. We saw mortars positioned to the left and right of the forest, with infantry howitzers and anti-tank guns next to them. We had only one goal: to push forward at any cost. Therefore, we only engaged in combat with those Russian guns that were aimed directly at us. In the middle of the forest, we came across a cemetery where the Russians buried their dead. They always buried their dead just behind the front line. When the encircled group of Russians was later eliminated, we discovered that the wooden crosses did not even bear the names of the dead. One example alone can show how much our operation depended on chance. In addition to conscientiousness and bravery, a soldier needs a little luck. A T-34 tank that suddenly appeared on a forest clearing turned sharply to the side. It was heading south in the same direction as us. Of course, it had no intention of attacking. It just wanted to break away from us in a southerly direction. For our part, we had no intention of shooting it down, because then it would have blocked the most important and only route for us. So this time, our intentions coincided. Too much time would have been lost before our sappers could blow this tank off the road, and I doubted that our operation would have been successful in that case. It was quite clear that the Russians in the tank were more interested in breaking through to the south than in preventing our attack. Several Russian tanks in separate sections of the cauldron to our left and right were still firing indiscriminately. Later, they were captured because even the Russians could only move on dirt and log roads, so a breakthrough to the south was impossible for them. When we reached the place where the advance units turned east, I left 2 vehicles to provide security. I myself drove back to the plain to reinforce the defensive line. The advance units reached their destination without significant losses. The situation made us realize how lucky we were to have such good cartographic materials. Thanks to this, we easily found every road and clearing. This would never have been possible with a regular map. That's all for today. If you liked the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. See you all soon.